History as it happens, July 20th, 2021. Vietnam Redux.
We in America sincerely hope that the year of the tiger will see peace come again to Vietnam.
We believe this essential to help safeguard the freedom of South Vietnam and to save the lives of those South Vietnamese, Americans, Australians.
It is the arena where communist expansionism is most aggressively at work in the world today.
How and why did America get involved in Vietnam in the first place? What choices do we have if we are to end the war? What are the prospects for peace?
As in Vietnam a half-century ago, the United States faces failure in Afghanistan after 20 years fighting an unwinnable war in a nation whose people, history, and culture we do not understand. As the final pullout nears, as the Taliban closes in on Kabul, the unlearned lessons of Vietnam may go unheeded again. That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Our overarching goal remains the same: to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to prevent its capacity to threaten America and our allies in the future.
My original instinct was to pull out, and historically, I like following my instincts.
The United States did what we went to do in Afghanistan, to get the terrorists to attack us on 9/11 and deliver justice to Osama bin Laden.
April 1975. The U.S. project in South Vietnam ends in humiliating fashion.
Panic has swept from the coastal city's crowded back streets and pagodas.
The city of Saigon was renamed today. The victorious communists who forced the city's surrender said the capital of South Vietnam henceforth will be known as Ho Chi Minh City. The fall of Saigon, or from the communist point of view, the liberation of Saigon, is seared in our memories. We've all seen images of helicopters plucking desperate evacuees from rooftops. It was a defeat that was supposed to serve as a warning to future generations about the folly of military intervention in faraway places. Well, if that was a key lesson of Vietnam, it went unlearned over the past 2 decades. I mean, do you even remember why the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in the first place? The goal, as stated by President Bush in October 2001 as the bombs started falling.
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
It was supposed to be a small footprint operation, not a nation-building experiment, and at first it seemed to go well. The Taliban was ousted from power, al-Qaeda was disrupted, and U.S. forces 10 years later caught up to bin Laden himself. But today the Taliban are winning the battles, and the U.S. nation-building effort appears to have failed too. Now, our military leaders have known this for years. Remember in late 2019, the Washington Post published what it called the Afghanistan Papers? U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence the war had become unwinnable. That same headline I just read could have been written in 1971 when the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers, exposing the mountain of lies upon which the Vietnam fiasco was built. And that is not the only dismal similarity between the two conflicts. There are many important differences, too, and who better to discuss it with than Harvard historian Fredrik Logevall, one of the preeminent Vietnam scholars in the country today. He is the author of Embers of War, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and he's currently writing the second of a 2-volume biography of JFK. The first volume was very well received. Fredrik Logevall, welcome.
Pleasure to be with you.
You know, when I started thinking about this discussion, I wanted to avoid approaching it in a cliched or hackneyed fashion. We should all be cautious about drawing comparisons, calling any war another Vietnam. After all, Afghanistan and Vietnam are dramatically different countries, and the wars America fought in each took place under very different circumstances. Yet I do see many similarities. What similarities do you see?
Well, I'm glad, Martin, that you alluded to differences because, as you rightly say, they are not the same. And that's something we might want to come back to. There are different conflicts, different places, different circumstances. I do think that there are important similarities, and I think they have become Well, I was going to say they've become more clear in recent years, but perhaps they were in some ways there from the very beginning. You've got a situation, for example, in which sanctuaries, let's look at this from an American perspective, sanctuaries matter a great deal in terms of what the enemy is able to do. So in the one case, we're talking about Pakistan. In the Vietnam War case, we're talking principally about Cambodia. And I think the ability of the adversary in this case, from a U.S. perspective, to repair to those sanctuaries is just enormously important, to regroup, to replenish, to recover, perhaps do more planning for future operations. So that's an issue, I think, where we see similarities. And corruption on the part of the local government is really important in both instances. And maybe the third one that I'll just mention here is an uncertainty on the part of U.S. officials in several administrations about what it is that they ultimately want to achieve, how they want to achieve it, and what in the end will constitute victory, or at least an opportunity to disengage from the country. Those are, it seems to me, some important similarities.
You've argued convincingly, in my view, that the domino theory was of less importance to Lyndon Johnson, McNamara, and the other holdovers from the Kennedy administration than U.S. credibility during the Cold War, an obsession over credibility that blinded our leaders to the reality on the ground in Vietnam. So, number one, am I getting that right? And number two, how is that similar to the situation today, where critics of President Biden's withdrawal decision are worried about the loss of U.S. credibility in the Afghanistan, greater Middle East region?
Yeah, it's a really good point that you raise. And it's true. I do argue in a few different books that, in fact, I think we historians have tended to exaggerate the importance of the domino theory. It was there, and it mattered quite a lot in the Eisenhower years. Of course, it's Dwight Eisenhower himself who popularized the phrase in a press conference in 1954. And I do think domino theorizing before he articulated the notion and afterwards mattered. By the time we get into the early and mid 1960s, so now we're talking the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, I think it had lessened. If we're talking about a geographic domino scenario, one country falls and then the neighboring countries one by one begin to fall, I think top officials had come to realize that that was too mechanistic, too simplistic. And so I think that the domino theory, yes, it became less important as you get into the period of heavy U.S. involvement. And it's replaced by, as you say, this concern about credibility. It's no longer a worry about individual countries falling one by one. It's now something more amorphous. It's now about what adversaries and allies will conclude about the credibility of U.S. power. Allies will no longer be able to depend on the U.S. Adversaries will no longer fear the U.S. The journalist Jonathan Schell referred to it as a psychological domino theory, and that's kind of true. They're connected. And I think that becomes, as you say, Martin, supreme in these important years of the so-called Americanization of the war. And I do think there are critics, as you say, of Joe Biden's policy, his decisions, who now fear that an American disengagement, full disengagement in military terms from Afghanistan, will yield the same blow to American credibility, that adversaries near and far will draw the same kind of conclusion about the dependability of American power. I'm skeptical. I don't think credibility historically has the kind of power or is the sort of concern that officials typically assign to it. But you're quite right that people are making that same connection.
But the word credibility loses its meaning after 5, 8, 10, now 20 years of war, when it's hard to explain what we're still doing there.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And here we could introduce an interesting character from the Vietnam story, which is George Ball, second in command at the State Department. And he said something that resonates with me and I think also applies to today. And it's precisely what you say. It loses a certain amount of meaning as time goes by. And what George Ball said is, in effect, I'm paraphrasing here, is what allies and adversaries will do is question our judgment. If we make a stand year after year in a place that, according to Ball, he was referring to Vietnam, of course, is of marginal strategic importance. It's not American dependability that they're going to question. It's ultimately U.S. judgment, U.S. sanity, if you will, in geostrategic terms. And I dare say George Ball would, if he were with us, as many others have, pose the same kind of question with respect to Afghanistan.
George Ball played a devil's advocate type figure, didn't he?
He sure did. And one of the things that I conclude, I'm a little mixed, I guess you could say, in my judgment of George Ball, because I do think he was, at least to a degree, assigned that particular role. He was told by Lyndon Johnson in so many words, I want you to question what it is that we're doing here. I want you to be, in effect, the devil's advocate. I don't doubt at all that George Ball meant what he said. I think he genuinely believed deep in his bones that escalating in Vietnam would be a huge mistake for the United States. He thought that the United States was destined to follow in the path of the French, suffer the same kind of result as the French, even though the United States was much more powerful. So I don't doubt his convictions, but I think it lessened the power of his advocacy because he had been told that he was going to have this role. He was not willing to resign in a huff, perhaps for good reason. He'd be on page one for one day in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and then he would be basically forgotten. So maybe that was a good decision on his part, but it did, yes, it lessened, I would argue, the power of his advocacy.
So Vietnam in the early 1960s was two countries, invented the decade prior, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Before the major U.S. troop buildup, South Vietnam was not a democracy. It was run by a U.S.-backed autocrat, No Dinh Diem, who lacked legitimacy among his subjects, so to speak. The countryside outside Saigon did not view Diem as a legitimate ruler who had any real control over what was going on there anyway, in the villages and hamlets, right?
Yeah, I think that's basically the case. He had certainly some support outside the more urban areas of the country. But your broad conclusion is one that I would agree with. We need to take Diem seriously. Some of the scholarship that's come out over the last 12, 15 years, let's say, has done a very important service. He was not a mere puppet of the United States. He was not somebody who was always destined to crash and burn. No Dinh Diem had his own thought through, if you will, sense of what was best for his country. He was a nationalist. He was courageous. But you're also quite right in saying that his government lacked sufficient support among South Vietnamese. He was myopic in his political vision, if you will. He tended to delegate mostly to family members. He relied too much on Catholics. He didn't have a sense of what was necessary to really mount an effective, especially political response to the insurgency and to what was coming from North Vietnam. I think that's at least my take on this. By the time you get into 1963, in the Kennedy administration, U.S. officials had basically concluded among themselves that we're not going to win with this guy. I think they had a hope that they could win with the next guy, which I think turned out to be a misjudgment. But they concluded that you were not going to win with Diem, and especially perhaps with his brother, No Dinh Nhu, who was a very powerful figure in the government. And of course, they then supported a coup against these two that had very important consequences.
A coup that Kennedy regretted in the short time he had left to live. He was assassinated himself shortly after that.
Yeah, he did. I mean, there's a remarkable clip, a monologue by John F. Kennedy, I think on the 4th of November. The coup occurs on the 1st and 2nd. Diem and Nhu are both killed, which is something that Kennedy, either naively or not, I think didn't expect to happen. This is a fellow Catholic. He had been supported by the United States for 9 years, and now he was dead, not only ousted, but dead. And Kennedy, in this audio clip, which is available on the web, he muses about what this means. And he says, we have to accept a large amount of responsibility for what happened.
I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup.
He then offers some words of praise of Diem.
I was shocked by the death of Diem and Nhu. I'd met Diem with Justice Douglas many years ago. He was an extraordinary character.
I play this for my students in class quite a lot. I conclude that Kennedy is legitimately shocked by the death of Diem. And we, of course, know, listening to this, that, as you say, he himself is going to be killed, 2.5, 3 weeks later. It's an astonishing audio tape.
I brought up Diem and his successors, who we don't need to name one by one, because the government of South Vietnam throughout the war seemed to lack legitimacy, wasn't all that effective at combating the insurgency in the South. The people of South Vietnam could see with their own eyes that if it were not for the presence of the United States, the government in Saigon would not be there. So Kabul today, the government in Kabul is backed by the United States and seems incapable of, quote unquote, securing the countryside.
Yeah, I think there's a strong connection between the two conflicts. I would argue with respect to Vietnam and ultimately with Afghanistan that the war has to be won politically if it's going to be won at all. And this, Martin, is the point that you're referring to, that there is not sufficient popular backing for the government. And maybe more to the point, sufficient commitment on the part of enough South Vietnamese to fight for that government. And if necessary, to die for that government. To be sure, there were many South Vietnamese on the military side who fought courageously, who fought with skill, dedication. There were just not enough of them. And that's ultimately what proves to be, I think, really, really fatal for the war effort. And as you say, South Vietnamese understood, Afghans understand that it's only with the backing of the United States that this government survives. And they see, in many cases, in the Vietnam case, they can see that there's not security in the countryside, even with that massive American backing. So some of them conclude we're either going to sit this one out, or maybe we're even going to back the insurgency, because the insurgency at least is offering us protection. And it's clear that this government in Saigon or in Kabul cannot function apart from massive American support. It is maybe the key, certainly a key problem with respect to the war effort from an American perspective in both conflicts.
I was going to say, it doesn't necessarily mean or stand to reason that ordinary Afghans, who of course are not a monolithic group of people, a diverse country it is, but that ordinary Afghans want to live under the Taliban, no more than ordinary Vietnamese peasants in the South wanted to live under communism. However, they could sympathize with that cause when they saw, say, American bombs raining down on their villages.
Yeah, no, you make a very good point. We should not conclude from this that either the vast majority of Vietnamese or the vast majority of Afghans are supportive of, in the case of the United States, the adversary's position, or want to live under those regimes. But I think it's very hard for a local populace to see an occupying army as its friend. I think this is true in all wars. And this is maybe something that American officials were not sufficiently cognizant of, maybe because they didn't see themselves as an occupying army. They maybe said or tried to convince themselves, we're there to help a friend. We're not an occupying force. But the point is that I think in the case of, let's say, Vietnam, I think for a lot of Vietnamese, this was hard. And this is where Hanoi, where Ho Chi Minh, when he was alive, and then his successors, were pretty adept at saying, do you really want, to the Vietnamese people, do you really want another foreign power like the French to be here telling us what to do at the point of a gun? I don't think so. And I think that was really difficult for the mass of Vietnamese to stomach, even if, as you rightly say, they didn't have a love of communism or a desire to live under Hanoi's rule per se, because they could already see, even before the war ended, that Hanoi was repressive, that leaders in North Vietnam could be extremely brutal. But there's still an advantage there on some level, it seems to me, for the insurgency / Hanoi that the Americans and the South Vietnamese could not overcome.
The insurgency in South Vietnam was not solely imported or exported from the north down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the south. There was a native insurgency, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This is a matter on which historians disagree, have disagreed, I think will continue to disagree. To what extent can we say that this insurgency is indigenous to the South? To what extent is this just imposed by Hanoi and maybe to some extent with support from the Chinese and the Soviets? Is this external aggression into South Vietnam? I think, as I think you're implying here, I think it's a mixture of both. I do think that the insurgency is in part Southern in its origin. In fact, it takes Hanoi leaders to some degree by surprise. They have a set of decisions to make, which they make, of course, about whether to support it, whether to direct it, to what extent. I think they ultimately do take more or less full charge of the revolution. But its origins, as I think you're saying, Martin, are complex.
Well, I learned a lot about that from reading your book, Embers of War. As a non-historian, I'm aware of these arguments. I do not make them originally myself. So to my next question, both Afghanistan and Vietnam were at war for many years before the U.S. troops arrived. In Afghanistan in the 1980s, the U.S. supported the Mujahideen. That began during the Carter years. And in Vietnam, you already alluded to the French efforts to take the country back after World War II. It doesn't happen. In 1954, the Geneva Accords, the United States agrees that there should be elections to unify the country in a few years. But the U.S. reneges on that promise when it becomes apparent that a certain individual in North Vietnam, who is the most politically popular person in the country, would win the elections.
It's really true, privately. And it's a really interesting thing, it seems to me, in both wars, by the way, to make a separate point briefly, that we're learning more and more now about the Afghanistan case, that what U.S. officials at senior levels and, let's say, middle levels, and also U.S. intelligence officers, what they are saying privately does not match what they're saying publicly. And this is a very interesting example of this. U.S. officials, I think, understood privately that if you had a fair election in Vietnam in the mid-1950s, earlier mid-1950s, Ho Chi Minh was going to win that election. They were, of course, not willing to say that publicly. And when Ngo Dinh Diem opted to bypass the elections that had been called for in the Geneva Conference of 1954, which effectively ended the French War, when he opted to bypass those elections, the United States supported him. A very fateful decision, I argue, in Embers of War. And in a sense, it sets the course, if you will, on which the United States will then travel for the better part of the next 2 decades, which is to try to build up, to sustain an independent, non-communist South Vietnam.
We've been talking a lot about similarities. Let's talk about some differences. One more similarity. I'll meld both of these points into one question. ARVN, that's South Vietnam's army, relied heavily on U.S. air power, as does Afghanistan's army, even after 20 years of U.S. training and billions of dollars. So it's kind of maddening to me when I hear politicians or pundits call for the United States to stay in Afghanistan. They can't seem to explain why, after all this time, the Afghan army is still incapable of defeating the Taliban. That's number one. Major difference between the two conflicts is the U.S. casualties and troop commitments. At the height of the Vietnam War, 500,000 American troops in the country. In 1968, about 16,000 Americans die. So that's a major difference. I don't know if that matters all that much today, but I'll let you take a hack at that.
Let's talk about those two. I think it's true that despite massive infusions of resources in both instances, in the Vietnam case and in the Afghanistan case, the United States, broadly speaking, failed to construct the kind of military force, the kind of army that was necessary to go toe-to-toe with the adversary. The ARVN, with notable exceptions, and we should mention that there are important exceptions, that is to say, officers and enlisted men who fought courageously and well, but it could not give as good as it got. Broadly speaking, I think that's quite clear. And the same thing is true in Afghanistan. Complicated reasons for it in both instances, which we can pursue, but I think that's, broadly speaking, the case. And that's, needless to say, a problem in a military conflict. If the military that you are supporting is not able to hold its own, preferring to withdraw or to draw back rather than to take the enemy on, you've got problems. And as you point out, this is the case even with massive American air power. And on your second point, yes, it's a very important difference. The size of the American commitment in terms of the number of troops at its peak in Vietnam in early 1969 which is when it reaches its peak early in the Nixon years, you've got about 550, 560 American combat forces on the ground in South Vietnam. And in 68 and 69, as you say, large numbers of American deaths, casualties and deaths, unlike anything we're seeing on the Afghanistan side. That's a very important difference between the two conflicts. And of course, it then matters in terms of popular attention that Americans are paying to the conflicts. It's on the daily news night after night in the case of the Vietnam War. Newspaper reporters and television reporters are also able to show more in the Vietnam case. That's a very important difference, how the Pentagon handles news organizations, their access to the battlefield. But nevertheless, there's also way more casualties in the Vietnam case that are not there in the Afghanistan case. And it affects, it seems to me, rather obvious point, I guess, but the degree to which the American public is paying attention to these conflicts, very different.
There's no draft today. There's no peace movement to speak of. You don't see many peace protests in the streets.
Correct.
Or demonstrations of any kind. When we think of Vietnam, we often forget just how many people demonstrated in favor of staying in Vietnam. So,
yeah, in fact, it's an interesting point, if I may, Martin. I'm struck by the degree to which the American public is really remarkably patient in the Vietnam case. There's this idea that limited wars are to fight because the public will not stand for it. They're going to get really impatient. They're going to demand that you either win this thing now or you come home. I don't really see it. You have a split opinion, as I think you're suggesting. You have people on both sides here, even those who don't like the Vietnam War. And if you look at the public opinion polling in the late 60s, people are also saying, well, I want the boys home, but I don't want it to just be a tuck tail and run kind of thing. In other words, I want this to yield some kind of settlement that can allow us to say that we achieved something. So I think in both wars, maybe this is back on the side of the ledger that has similarities. The public is actually pretty patient, it seems to me, with what officials are doing. They're inclined to trust the president and give him, a lot of leeway.
I'm not sure how many Americans were paying close attention to Afghanistan any longer. 2,300 U.S. military personnel have died in Afghanistan since 2001, 94 since 2014. Tragic for their families, of course, but by way of comparison, in Vietnam, 58,000 Americans died. If 500 people a month were dying in Afghanistan, the national climate today would be quite different. So let's move on to Nixon. When he gets into office, he realizes the war cannot be won, but he expands it anyway. He and Kissinger negotiate what is called a decent interval. Instead of simply telling the American people straight away, look, the war is lost, we have to get out of there, they try to soften the blow. What was the decent interval?
Yeah, it's exactly as you say. That is the solution, if you will, that they ultimately decide upon. And what it basically means is that there should be a decent enough interval between the departure of U.S. forces and the fall of Saigon, the victory of the communists in the war. That has to be a sufficiently large period of time. I'm not sure they ever decided how long that period should be, but say ideally a couple of years. That would be a decent interval for them. And it suggests, as you point out, that the two of them have reached the decision that we cannot win this thing in any meaningful sense. We maybe can keep the patient alive, that is to say South Vietnam, for a little while longer, but the patient's going to succumb. When precisely they reach that decision is, again, a point of contention among historians. I personally think they got to it, even if they didn't call it decent interval, I think they got to it pretty early. But again, other historians will say that it comes later, maybe in 1971, but not before. And the question then, which is also a bone of contention, is what did Nixon and Kissinger believe when they came into office in 1969? Did they both believe even then that you can't win this thing and we've just got to manage a withdrawal effectively? Or did they think, some part of them at least, we can do better here. We can succeed where Johnson failed through increased use of air power, better use of ground troops, linkage, meaning we'll get the Soviets and the Chinese to pressure Hanoi to agree to a deal more or less on our terms. Did they entertain that idea? It's hard to say, at least based on the research I've done. I'm inclined to say that they were pretty pessimistic in their heart of hearts.
Thank you for pointing out when I mentioned something that is still in dispute among scholars. You know, a cynical look at the decent interval would indicate that Nixon knew the war could not be won, but he didn't want to catch blame for it, didn't want to make it look like the United States was losing a war.
No, it's really true. And it points to something we haven't discussed, Martin, but I think is worth underscoring. And I think it's true under at least three presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And that is the importance, it seems to me, of domestic politics in the United States. That the most important audience, at least in some regards, is not, the audience in Saigon or Hanoi or the audience in Moscow or Beijing. It's in fact the audience in Peoria. It's the audience in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the country. That what they're really concerned about, these presidents, is what will be the effect on my administration and my chance of re-election, my domestic agenda, and my other foreign policy priorities. What will be the effect on those if Vietnam is lost or is perceived to have been lost on my watch? I think it's critically important. It's a theme in my work, the degree to which this matters, that the outcome in South Vietnam and Vietnam in general, it matters to a large extent because of the damage it could do to the presidents and their parties' political position. And I think Democrats in particular, so Kennedy and Johnson, feared the so-called soft on communism charge that Republicans would be sure to level against them. And I'm working on JFK right now, and it's clear that Kennedy thought about this both as he was running for president in the late 1950s, and this is something that matters, even if he's not going to really admit it.
And already President Biden is being accused by his critics, many Republicans, of creating another fall of Saigon type moment because the Taliban is making so much progress on the battlefield. It's not easy for a president to say what Biden is saying. Look, he's not saying we lost the war. He's saying we accomplished what we wanted to, but we can't stay there forever. After all, while the United States has had a contingent of troops in the country, along with 7,000 NATO troops, the Taliban has been making progress on the battlefield. But it's still not easy to square with the American people after so much blood and treasure has been spent.
I think it's very hard for a president to do it. And
I would say he has to at this point.
I suppose one reason he has to do it is because it accords with his own view on this. We know that as vice president under Obama, he was maybe not a lone holdout or a lone person to argue against the surge that Obama agreed to in 2009, but he was certainly skeptical that you would achieve success with what was ultimately still a rather modest increase given the size of the country and the complexity of the country. Biden believed then, what reason is there to believe that this is going to prove to be more successful than what we've seen over the past, 8 years? And so I think he's been a skeptic on this thing all the way through, but went along with it as vice president and now sees an opportunity here and a need to end this thing. I think he's not at all convinced that with a very small number of troops that are currently there, you have any prospect of success. And therefore, it's incumbent upon him, it's required of him as commander-in-chief to call an end to this thing. I think that's what he's decided, but I think you're right. It's not an easy decision for him, in part for domestic political reasons, because, Republicans are going to be saying to the country now, I predict, that when you see an increase in civil war in Afghanistan, when you see more turmoil, more bloodshed, they're going to say that Biden allowed this thing to fall, even though in some ways he's following through on negotiations that were begun under Trump.
You made a point about the multiple presidencies of each conflict. At the end, as the North Vietnamese are overrunning the South, it's Gerald Ford who is faced with the ultimate decision, I suppose, on whether to provide air support, but it's Congress that once and for all cuts off funding and effectively ends the Vietnam War. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it's true. The congressional story, Congress and Vietnam, is a really interesting one, worthy of a worthy of a book if anybody who's listening is looking for a topic. I do think that the role played by Congress in the early years in basically giving a blank check, if you will, to the administrations, that is to say, Congress being unwilling to step up and play its constitutional role, and then later on, 69, 70, 71, beginning to assert a certain amount of power that it has to limit what Nixon can do. First, what Johnson can do, but then what Nixon can do. And ultimately, as you say, Ford.
I must say that I'm frustrated by the action of the Congress in not responding to some of the requests, both for economic, humanitarian, and military assistance in South Vietnam. And I'm frustrated by the limitations that were placed on the chief executive over the last 2 years.
It's a really important part of the story. And as you say, it is ultimately Congress that I think plays an absolutely critical role in bringing U.S. involvement to a close. And when it appears certain that Hanoi is about to take over the South in early 1975, Congress sticks to its position and basically says, no, we're not going to allocate the necessary funding to continue this. So yes, no question, Congress plays a really important role in those final years.
Good segue into one of my final questions for you, Fredrik. What are your thoughts on how Congress today has become so pliant, so passive when it comes to allowing the executive branch to wage endless war? And the authorization for use of force in Afghanistan is about 20 years old. And wasn't that one of the lessons of the Vietnam War, to rein in executive overreach because of the way Nixon and Kissinger, among other things, secretly bombed Cambodia, which was a neutral country?
Yeah. It's a really large question. I don't know that I have a great answer to it because it's something that I'm puzzling over myself, even as a historian who studies this stuff up close. More in historical terms, obviously, than in terms of contemporary developments. But I would say that Congress remains very reticent. Senators, House members are, I think, reluctant still now to become really assertive on foreign policy. For complicated reasons. Often the issues at play are complex and they don't have the sufficient expertise, they feel, to really intervene in a serious way on these issues. Often, I think they fear the political ramifications for their own re-election, perhaps. And so they're also, for that reason, quite inclined to defer to the executive branch. And finally, I think often the issues at stake are sufficiently difficult that they would just as soon be happy to let the administration handle these issues. It's a relatively small number of lawmakers who want to assert themselves in this way.
So, therefore, one of the most important lessons of Vietnam remains unlearned.
Yeah. No, I think it's true. I hope that, in fact, sufficient members of Congress in both parties learn, if you will, their constitutional history and come to understand that they have an important role to play. Yes, there are times when the executive branch needs to be able to act more or less on its own. Classic example, which I'm studying right now for volume 2 of my JFK biography, is, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When you have an acute crisis in which decisions of great consequence have to be made really fast, then I think it's appropriate and right for the executive branch, for the president and his or her top advisors to be making key decisions. You still consult with Congress. Kennedy called in congressional leaders, at key moments during the missile crisis. Most foreign policy decisions, including momentous decisions about whether to commit military force to this or that conflict, in which there's ample room, it seems to me, for senior members of both houses to be actively involved, to insist on having a seat at the table, if I can use that phrase. And I think our foreign policy would be much better for it.
Fredrik Logevall, we thank you for your time and your insights today, the author of Embers of War, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and also working on the second volume of a 2-volume biography of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Volume 1, titled JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Understanding Populism.
Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families.
From William Jennings Bryan to Huey Long to George Wallace to Donald Trump, populism's been a slippery term, meaning different things to different people at different times in our history. What does it mean to be a populist today? That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.